My father handed the family business to his new wife's son and kicked me out. I sat at the long mahogany dining table, my fingers gripping the stem of an untouched wine glass. The air in the room was thick with expensive perfume and the false warmth of forced smiles. Tonight was supposed to be my night. My father had promised. Years of work, dedication, and sacrifices led to this moment. I had earned my place. Lori sat beside him, her manicured nails tapping against her glass in a slow, rhythmic pattern. Tyler leaned back in his chair, smirking like he already knew the outcome of this so-called family gathering. Maybe he did. Maybe I had been the only fool still holding on to faith. My father raised his glass, clearing his throat, making it clear that he had an important announcement. He spoke with certainty, stating that Tyler would be the one to take over the company. The words didn't register at first. It felt like he had spoken a foreign language. Tyler, the same person who spent his days throwing away trust fund money on cars he didn't know how to drive. The same person who had never stepped foot in the company's headquarters unless it was to charm the secretaries. Looking at my father's face, I searched for any indication that this was a mistake, a joke, anything. But there was only unwavering certainty. This wasn't happening. My stomach twisted in knots, and my fingers clenched tighter around the glass. Lori's voice cut through the moment like a perfectly sharpened knife, reinforcing the decision. She justified it with talk about fresh energy and new perspectives, dismissing everything I had worked for. She claimed Tyler had the vision that the company needed. Heat rushed to my face. I had spent years earning my place, completing my MBA, working tirelessly for 3 years, building relationships, improving operations. But none of that mattered. The decision had already been made. Tyler's laughter brought me back to the moment. He had the audacity to suggest that I could stay on, maybe take a position in HR since I was good with people. The smugness in his voice was unbearable. I pushed my chair back, the screeching sound cutting through the quiet murmurs in the room. It was suffocating. I needed air before I said something I'd regret. Walking out, my heels clicked against the marble floor, and not a single person stopped me. Not even my father. The cold air outside hit me like a slap. Fumbling for my phone, my vision blurred, fingers trembling, I saw a message from Sophie. She had asked how it went. The reply came out instinctively. There was nothing to sugarcoat. Everything had been given to Tyler. A second later, the 3 little dots appeared, then stopped. She was probably figuring out how to respond without making things worse. But how could it be worse? Movement from the corner of my eye made me look up. My father stood by the window, watching me. His face was unreadable. For a moment, it seemed like guilt was there, lingering. Maybe he regretted it. Then Lori appeared beside him, placing a hand on his arm and whispering something. Without hesitation, he turned away. And just like that, it was clear. I was on my own. 3 days had passed, but the sting of betrayal hadn't dulled. I barely slept, my mind replaying the moment over and over. Every sip of coffee tasted bitter. Every glance at my phone felt like a reminder of what I had lost. Sitting in my family's longtime attorney Richard's office now, the weight of the past week pressed down on my shoulders. The room smelled of polished wood and leather, sterile and professional, a stark contrast to the chaos in my head. He adjusted his glasses and flipped through a stack of documents, pausing for a moment before glancing up at me. The answer was as brutal as I feared. A year ago, my father had restructured the company, shifting control to Tyler. This wasn't some rash, emotional decision. It had been in the works for a long time. My father had planned my removal, deliberately cut me out, and never once warned me. He had let me believe I had a future there, let me give years of my life to a company that was never meant to be mine. The realization sent a fresh wave of anger through me. Richard slid a thick file across the desk. His expression was neutral, but there was something in his eyes, a hesitation, maybe even sympathy. He mentioned my grandmother's will, something I had never thought to question. My father had always been the one to handle estate matters after my grandmother passed, and I had trusted him. But Richard was telling me that there was something meant for me, something even my father wasn't aware of. A trust fund. $2 million, locked away with conditions. My grandmother had anticipated the family's politics, had foreseen the power struggles. The money wasn't just handed over, it came with one simple rule. I had to build something of my own. If I opened a successful business, the funds would be mine. I stared at the papers, my mind racing. I had spent my entire life proving myself to a father who never intended to give me a chance. And now, someone else, someone who had been gone for years, was giving me a way out. It felt like a message from beyond, like my grandmother had known I would need this lifeline. My fingers traced the edge of the documents as the weight of the moment settled in. This wasn't just money. It was an opportunity, a way to reclaim control, a way to ensure that neither my father nor Tyler had any influence over my future. 100 thoughts ran through my mind. I could start something new, something that was entirely mine. But what? What business would be worth walking away from the empire I had spent years fighting for? The idea of letting them win, of letting them push me out so easily, made my stomach turn. Then another thought crept in, one that sent a slow, calculated smirk across my lips. I wouldn't tell them. Not yet. Let them believe they had won. Let them enjoy their victory. Because soon enough, I'd build something they couldn't take from me. And when I did, I'd make sure they knew exactly who they underestimated. I gathered the papers, my grip tightening. There was no need to make a scene, no need to tip them off. Not yet. I thanked Richard, nodded at his offer to help with the paperwork, and walked out into the bright afternoon light. Standing in the parking lot, I let the wind whip through my hair, my pulse steadying. I had a chance to start over, to build something from the ground up. For the first time in days, I felt a sense of power, not the kind given by others, but the kind I was about to take for myself. One thing was certain, I wasn't done yet. I sat across from Sophie at our usual spot in the cafe, stirring my coffee, even though I had no intention of drinking it. The past few days had been a blur, a mix of anger, disappointment, and something else, determination. I had spent too much time fighting for something that was never meant to be mine. It was time to focus on something new. Sophie listened intently as I laid it all out. I was done trying to prove myself to a family that never saw my worth. If I was going to put my energy into something, it had to be mine. The idea had been forming in my head since I left Richard's office. Sustainable packaging. A business that mattered, something modern, something that people actually needed. I had the knowledge, the contacts, and now, thanks to my grandmother, the resources. Sophie's eyes lit up as I explained the concept. She knew how much I had sacrificed for my father's company, how much of myself I had poured into it. This wasn't just about starting over, it was about proving to myself more than anyone that I could do this. That I wasn't just some pawn my father could discard. Then the door opened, and just like that, the moment shattered. Tyler walked in, exuding that same obnoxious confidence he always carried, like he had just won some invisible game. The air shifted the second he spotted me. The smirk, the slow, deliberate walk toward my table. It was classic Tyler. He lived for these moments, where he could hover over me and remind me that he had won. He leaned against the table, looking at me like I was some sad, lost cause. His tone was casual, amused, like my presence here was some kind of joke. The way he spoke, it was as if my entire existence had been reduced to nothing more than a failed attempt at success. I didn't flinch. I met his gaze head-on, my expression unreadable. He made a lazy comment about HR still hiring, like I would come crawling back just to work under him. I didn't hesitate. I laid it out plainly. I was launching my own business. He reacted exactly how I expected, a short, barking laugh, followed by an exaggerated look of disbelief. Then, lowering his voice just slightly, he asked the question he really wanted answered. Where was I getting the money? That was the real issue, wasn't it? In his mind, I had nothing. No job, no inheritance, no leverage. He thought I was grasping at straws, taking a shot in the dark. I didn't correct him. Let him think I was struggling. Let him believe I was playing a game I couldn't win. Then came the offer. A lifeline disguised as a favor. He could talk to my father. Maybe there was still a place for me in the company. Under him, of course. Maybe he could make room for me. Maybe I could swallow my pride and take whatever scraps he decided to throw my way. Sophie stiffened beside me, but I didn't take the bait. I smiled, slow and deliberate, the kind of smile that made people uneasy. Then I told him no. No anger, no dramatic outburst. Just a simple, firm rejection. The shift in his expression was subtle, but I caught it. A flicker of something, maybe frustration, maybe realization. For the first time, maybe, he understood that I wasn't the same person he had dismissed so easily before. I watched as he turned and walked away, his shoulders a little stiffer than before. Sophie exhaled beside me, shaking her head. Then, without hesitation, she reached across the table, gripping my hand. She was in. Whatever I was planning, whatever I needed, she was in. And together, we were going to prove every single one of them wrong. Launching a business from scratch wasn't easy, but I wasn't expecting it to be. Every morning started with emails, calls, and negotiations. The paperwork alone was enough to drive me insane, but I pushed through. The company was official, suppliers were contacted, contracts were drafted. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't looking back, I was looking forward. Finding the right manufacturer was a nightmare. Most of them wanted bulk orders I wasn't ready for, but after days of digging, I found one willing to take a chance. I secured my first shipment of biodegradable packaging materials, enough to get the business rolling. The moment the contract was signed, something inside me shifted. This wasn't an idea anymore. It was real. Then came the breakthrough. A connection through Sophie introduced me to Natalie, a powerhouse in the restaurant industry. She ran one of the largest chains in the region, and she was actively searching for sustainable packaging options. The meeting was intense. Natalie didn't waste time on small talk. She grilled me on my product, my sourcing, my ability to deliver. But I knew my numbers, knew my process, and most importantly, I knew my worth. By the end of our conversation, she agreed to a pilot contract. My first real client. My first real win. I celebrated quietly. No social media posts, no press releases. Just a quiet dinner with Sophie, a glass of wine, and the satisfaction of knowing I was finally moving in the right direction. I knew better than to draw attention to myself. I knew my family knew Tyler. The moment they caught wind of my success, they'd find a way to get involved. And I was right. The first call came late at night. His voice was deceptively casual, acting like we were just catching up. But I knew better. He had heard about my deal with Natalie. He wanted in. Suddenly, his company was interested in sustainability. He suggested we work together, that we combine forces. The offer sounded reasonable on the surface, but I knew what it really was: control. He wanted leverage. I shut him down immediately. No discussion. No hesitation. Days later, he showed up at my office, acting like he had every right to be there. He leaned against my desk, tossing questions like they were harmless observations. Where did I get my funding? Who was backing me? His smile was tight, his eyes sharp. He was fishing, and I wasn't about to give him anything. I played it cool, keeping my answers vague, but I could tell he wasn't buying it. He knew I was hiding something. That only made him more determined. A few days passed, and I tried to focus on growing the business. Every spare second was spent refining my operations, reaching out to more potential clients, making sure my first orders were perfect. But something gnawed at me. I knew Tyler wasn't the type to just let this go. Then the bombshell dropped. A friend in the industry texted me from a conference I hadn't attended. Tyler had taken the stage and made an announcement. His company was entering the sustainable packaging market. Direct competition. He didn't just want to join me, he wanted to bury me. The message hit like a gut punch. This wasn't just business anymore. This was war. I stared at my phone, the text burning into my brain. Tyler thought he could push me out just like my father had. He thought I would back down. He was about to learn how wrong he was. I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to win. The rise of my company happened faster than I expected. The demand for sustainable packaging skyrocketed, and I was ahead of the curve. Contracts started piling up, small businesses, large chains, even government-backed initiatives. Within months, my company wasn't just surviving, it was dominating the market. The numbers didn't lie. Every month, We were breaking our own records, expanding faster than I ever imagined. Meanwhile, my father's company was sinking. They had bet everything on outdated models, refusing to pivot when the industry changed. Reports surfaced about environmental violations, lawsuits, and massive fines. News outlets ran stories on their shady practices, how they cut corners to save money but ultimately ended up losing more. Investors panicked. Customers abandoned them. The empire my father had built over decades was collapsing, and he had no one to blame but himself. At first, I kept my distance, watching from the sidelines as their downfall played out in real time. But then, something happened that I never expected. One afternoon, my assistant buzzed me. My father and Tyler were in the lobby. They wanted to meet. I almost laughed at the irony. Just a year ago, I wasn't even worth a seat at their table. Now, they were waiting in my lobby, hoping for a chance to plead their case. When they walked in, I barely recognized them. Tyler, once so smug and confident, looked exhausted, the weight of failure pressing down on him. My father, the man who had always been untouchable, seemed smaller, less sure of himself, less powerful. Tyler spoke first, trying to salvage some dignity. He framed it as a business opportunity, a chance to combine forces and create something new. He talked about the strengths of their company, its infrastructure, its reputation. He conveniently ignored the fact that both were crumbling. I let him talk. I let him paint his fantasy of collaboration, of redemption. I stole a glance at my father, who sat silent, hands clasped tightly in front of him. He wasn't arguing. He wasn't leading. He knew. He knew this was his last card to play. Then, Tyler got to the point. They were offering me control, majority shares, full ownership. They wanted me to save the company. A year ago, I would have jumped at the chance. I would have given anything to reclaim what was stolen from me. But sitting there listening to them beg, I realized something. I didn't need their company. I didn't need their validation. I had already built something better. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence stretch between us before shaking my head. No deal. No rescue. They had made their choice when they cast me aside. Now they would live with it. Tyler's face darkened, his jaw tightening. My father, though, simply nodded. He had known this was coming. Maybe he had known it from the start. They stood, gathered what little pride they had left, and walked out. No last words. No dramatic exits. Just silence. I watched them leave, waiting for the familiar sting of regret. But it never came. For the first time in my life, I was truly free. It had been weeks since my father and Tyler walked out of my office for the last time. Business was thriving, and for the first time in my life, I felt at peace. The war was over. Or so I thought. One afternoon, my assistant knocked and handed me a small envelope. No return address, just my name scrawled in familiar handwriting. I knew before opening it that it was from my father. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a signed document transferring the last of his worthless shares to me. It was almost laughable. They were just scraps, remnants of a company that no longer existed. But the note attached caught my attention. He admitted his mistakes, not in a grand, sweeping apology, but in the quiet, understated way he had always communicated things that truly mattered. He acknowledged that the company had been my birthright, and though he had taken it away, it had always been mine in some way. This was his way of making peace with that. It wasn't an offer, a plea, or a deal. It was closure. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel anger toward him. The weight of resentment that I had carried for years felt lighter. It didn't mean I forgave everything, but maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to keep fighting the ghost of what could have been. Later that evening, I found myself driving to his house. The place looked smaller than I remembered, more lived in, less like the cold, untouchable estate I had grown up in. When he opened the door, he looked surprised, but not unhappy to see me. We didn't talk about the past. There was no point. Instead, we sat on the porch, drinking coffee as the sun set, talking about everything and nothing at all. For the first time, we weren't business rivals, weren't father and daughter locked in a battle of pride. We were just two people trying to figure out what came next. By the time I left, I knew one thing for certain. I didn't need his company, his legacy, or his validation. I had built my own. But maybe, just maybe, there was still something worth salvaging between us. As I drove away, I felt lighter. This was the real victory, not just winning the business war, but finally letting go of the need to fight it.
Bye bye.